Hey everybody, this is Right Wing Dad here, and welcome to another episode of the Bearded Federalist Show. And also, happy game day to those who celebrate. I think I can speak for 3 out of the 4 of us here when I say roll damn tide. I know Dustin, he is a Auburn fan, but you know what? We're still going to treat him graciously. So
Auburn fans are humans too.
that is true. They
Are you
are
sure?
humans too.
I'm not convinced.
But so welcome Dustin to our show. A lot of you already know who Dustin is. He has become very popular on X in the last month or two just because of his work on Tim Walz and exposing him. And I don't know where Mark just went, but he should be back shortly. But Dustin is a Minnesota-based Republican. He's a strategist and president of Honey Hive Strategies, and he's also the leading expert on anything related to Tim Walz and exposing his lies. So welcome, and thanks for being on with us.
Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this. I know when you guys were starting this podcast, we're shooting back a couple different things, recommendations on everything. That was well before any of this took off because we were all big DeSantis people, supporters going. And then we actually brainstormed quite a bit on like, hey, how do we get some more media outlets out there and actually push some content of, here's some really good conservative apologetics we can push. The primary's over, and I think pretty much most of us are pretty much on board with Trump at this point. But
75%.
75%.
At least in this podcast.
We'll get Mark here in a little while, but sorry about that. But yeah, no, when you guys are starting this out, none of this is new. At one point, I think we were even talking about like, hey, let's get Dustin and a bunch of other people on and, get some good guests on. And, that things kind of blew up the moment my governor decided to put his name in the hat for the VP race. And, kind of the rest is history. A lot of people were doubting that from the very beginning, but at least here on the ground in Minnesota, just, I don't hate every Democrat in the state, and they don't hate me. But I've got some people that were leaking me information throughout this process, and they're pretty firm in stating that no, that he's at a worst case scenario in the top 3 in consideration here with Kelly as well as Shapiro. And this was when the betting odds, I think, he was outside the top 10. A lot of people were doubting that and laughing about it. It's just like, I don't know what to tell you. This is just what the sources are telling me. And then literally day or two later, I start hearing that he's been given vetting papers. From a family member told one of the operatives this, which then got to me. He's got vetting papers. They're very, very serious about this. And, started just putting together that timeline and everything. And I think just weeks before everything actually took off, I just looked at his schedule, saw where he was going. If you look at the RNC convention, just the next day or two after our guy, Vance, was announced, Tim Walz was at the RNC convention at a satellite location just outside of Milwaukee, giving a speech about how he read Hillbilly Elegy and how he grew up in a similar situation to Vance, but that's not what small town people are about. They don't go to Yale. They don't rag on their community that they came from, blah, blah, which turns out a lot of that stuff was just not very accurate in the first place. But he was creating a distinguishing difference between him and Vance. And I just kind of looked at that. I was like, that's interesting. You were given this national platform as the Governors Association chairman of the Democrats. You had the successful reelection campaign. The area they're struggling in that they need to get their votes in is the Midwest. And just I start adding everything up. And I was like, well, Dean Phillips, a congressman here in CD3, went against Joe Biden. I mean, that there's some information there where he knows Joe Biden's not in a good state. And then you see Walz continually just backing into him, Biden, that is, as well as all of our delegation gaining up on Phillips. I'm like, this is a little interesting too. What's up with that? And eventually, it's the floodgates break loose, and the second congresswoman ever to come out uh, against Biden is none other than Angie Craig, who is the exact neighbor to Dean Phillips in one of the more competitive districts in the country that we have here. Joe Tarab and her are going to be going head to head, and that's going to be a key seat for deciding the majority in the House. And if we win that seat, Minnesota is actually going to have majority Republicans in Congress. We'll have
No way.
That's awesome.
a 3-5 majority. Right now, it's 4-4 split. So Minnesota, far more purple than people would like to believe. It's just that we have these 4 areas that are just pretty solid blue, and they account for 55%, 60% of the people.
Yeah,
Um,
I actually I kind of put a little poll out yesterday,
mhm.
since you were going to be on, and I was, asking people um, just questions, and one of those is related, but we can get to that later.
Yeah.
But what I kind of wanted to touch up on, I don't know where Mark went. He might be having some technical difficulties, but just who is Tim Walz?
Yeah.
I know he's got a very long history. Some of it true, some of it not. But if you could just give us some insight to that.
Yeah. And I think just to open premise that what a lot of people have found out about Walz's history. And I mean, my time in Minnesota politics started around 2012. His started around 2005. So he started a little bit before me, but I picked up quite a bit from some of the brightest minds here in the state, operatives that are really big into research, and they've handed some information over to me, knowing that I have a little bit bigger of a platform that we can actually put some of this information out. So they've been very helpful with that. But in essence, to premise all of that is at best, Walz very, very often just likes to uh, exaggerate his past, exaggerate his accomplishments, anything
So,
from, well,
so
teacher of
it's
the
not
year.
it's not a grammatical error,
Yeah,
correct?
that might be a little bit closer to a grammatical error. I mean, like example could be like what we kind of we're all big fans of, like 3 Year Letterman on Twitter, and
Yeah.
like, oh, I was the coach of the state championship team. I mean, that's like saying, like, me, Dustin, I'm a state champion track athlete. I mean, I was an okay at track athlete. I was well above average. I could run under a 5-minute mile, but my teammates who actually went to the state competition were running 4:20. they they were much faster. But that's like saying I was. But in reality, Walz wasn't the head coach. Kind of like he's kind of exaggerating. He was the assistant coach. He won the teacher of the year, but like it was the school district teacher of the year. Like it's kind of these exaggerated, grammatical errors. Really just pushing forward more than what it actually is. You win an award with the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. Well, it wasn't the state chamber; it was the youth chamber of some type. So, like, there's just these exaggerations to your record that you just have to wonder, like, what's with all of this? And of course, the much more serious accusation, which obviously is true in the scenario, is the stolen valor claims of, all right, well, you were a command sergeant major. Well, you were for about 45 days under the assumption that you would, one, complete your time, and two, complete your education to do so. He didn't. So then the day before his retirement, they bumped him down a rank. But he's been running with it ever since, even on his archived government account. which he can't change at this point because it's just far too late. He's been out of Congress for a decade. It still says on their retired command Sergeant Major, but he's not. So that's the far more serious one of these exaggerations, but just also outright lies. You go back to that time at the beginning of Walz's career. The one I'm just at least remembering off the top of my head is kind of his start in politics was there was a John Kerry event. And I think this one actually more recently kind of went viral. I thought it came out earlier, but apparently I missed that one. It's been a pretty common one, but there's this backstory to him that he was rejected from going into a George Bush rally with his students because they were Democrats. And it just turns out that story just simply isn't true. They were there to protest it. They were outside with signs protesting the event, and just all of it's fabricated. And there's a really good story out there. I forget the exact outlet that puts that story out there more recently, and maybe we'll add that in the notes later. But Alpha News also has a good piece on that. And for anyone who actually wants to figure out more about Walz's past, Alpha News, a collaborate here in Minnesota, they're a conservative media outlet. They are incredible at all this. Liz Collin is kind of the head over there, the face of the organization. If you ever want to find out more about this stuff, I mean, they're an incredible resource. Go follow Alpha News. They're always putting out new content, but also just a treasure trove of content to go back on. And I'm actually going to be putting out some stuff that they had reported on in the past as well going forward here. We're just kind of letting things set a little bit before we put out some more Walz oppo. We got to stretch this thing out till the election. But
Yeah, so
yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong. Now, Tim Walz obviously says that's, he kicked out of a George Bush rally, and that's why he decided to, enter
Yeah, why you
politics.
decided to run for
But
Congress.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I could have sworn that he quit the military and then ran for political office right then and there.
Yeah, it was a very quick turnaround, and that's kind of where this whole controversy comes in on did he, dodge Iraq and dodge this whole process. And I believe actually we're about to have a pretty huge interview on Monday, if anyone caught this one, but Megyn Kelly is actually going to be reporting and doing an interview with 4 of his former service members, and they're actually going to go in depth into this. There's some really good content out there, again, through Alpha News and some of these other local outlets. Some of them have gone on national television as well, going on to state that they actually brought these stories to the Star Tribune, our largest distributed paper in the state, and brought up their story and like, hey, he dodged his deployment and here's how he did it. And at first they were a little skeptical, but they said, yeah, we'll look into it. They got back to him, and then he stated on national television that indeed the Star Tribune editor is telling him, yep, we looked into your story. It's all true. It's good. We're going to write a story. And then, time passes by after that. They get back to him. Hey, we're actually not going to write a story. Our bosses got back to us and they think it might influence the elections. Therefore, we're not going to do a story. And it just goes to show on how he's been able to get away with so many of these things over time. I mean, if a Republican does half of this stuff, they don't have a career in politics,
It's over.
period.
Let me ask you a question, Dustin. So, in all of your research on Tim Walz and your firsthand experience, is there anything that he's done other than, and we have to say, 24 years in the service? That's impressive. We should thank him for it. But
yes,
anything other than that he's done that is actually impressive, or you think that gives him the ability to serve the country in the vice president's office in any capacity?
I mean, I will give him this. He's an extremely effective executive, similar to DeSantis in that manner, but obviously the exact opposite results that we want. There have been many scenarios in the last couple legislative sessions where we've had senior Republicans put together some really good compromises. Where when we had one-seat majorities, and as well one-seat deficits in the Senate. We have very close margins in that area, where they came up with good compromises. And they put them forward, and then they're about to pass. They're going to go to committee. They're about to have their brief debate, talk over it, and then vote it through to go to the floor, so they could vote it on at that point. But then they get caught on hot mics that the governor actually called, and we're going to be removing these two pieces. And I believe in that case it was a vaccine mandate as well as Zuckerbucks for elections. They wanted to remove those two things in particular from that legislation going forward in that committee. And just goes to show how impressive he's been with, pushing his agenda. And a lot of people will kind of hide behind the fact of like, oh, well, he didn't actually want that. That was this legislature pushing this. But all along the way, Walz is pushing the buttons behind all of this. And there's actually been a lot of critical pieces in his first term as governor on this stuff, where people were criticizing him because he's too much a part of the legislative process and not as much of an executive. And, that goes back to his time in Congress, where he's so used to being involved with all of the steps up to passing this legislation versus he's the governor now. He shouldn't be a part of that process. This should be this committees and these bodies, and then he can make decisions and he can give input a little bit. But he got criticism for being a part of every single step along the way, being a micromanager. So ultimately, he owns all of these policies, especially the ones obviously that he ended up signing, and in some case send back and made them even crazier.
Yeah,
It's just in a purple state like this, it's just kind of wild.
Speaking of crazy, I know that he's gotten a lot of blowback because of his COVID record, and I know you've done some extensive work exposing that. Can you shed some light on, what all he mandated and proposed during COVID?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one in particular that I just got to open with because I might forget it otherwise, is the time in which he basically pinned everything on youth sports, which I think was just the grossest thing throughout this entire process of COVID. There were massive issues with his numbers on in-home care. We had worse numbers than New York. We were worst in the nation. People were dying everywhere. And they hired a PR company to basically connect all of this stuff to youth sports and then blame youth sports for all of it. So they would cut that off. And we actually had, it was just a regular mom by the name of Don Gilman. She eventually ended up running for the state house the following cycle and got in. So now she's a current legislator here. But she started an organization called Let Them Play Minnesota. And she actually has a son who's very gifted running back, receiver, he's kind of like a Tyreek Hill type player, very quick, agile. He won Mr. Football for the state of Minnesota here and he was just in Wright County where I live. And this kid couldn't play. And this kid had a legitimate opportunity to play Division I ball and go play professional football. And you can't play. And she had a big problem with this, as well as, everything else that was going on with youth sports. So she actually went after the governor and ended up suing the administration and won. But throughout that process, actually found these emails showing that they were connecting these dots on blaming youth sports in that process. And that's how they ultimately, ended up winning. They weren't following the science on any of this stuff. They were just finding a PR excuse to make up for their bad numbers and cover it with something else and blame something else, like those horrible Republicans in Wright County who are super conservative and aren't wearing masks. They're the problem. It's not everything else going with these policies with Governor Walz and bringing sick people into a sick place with high-risk individuals and, having the worst numbers in the country. Unlike you look at a guy like DeSantis, where they pushed very heavily to get some of these resources over to that community and really focused on them and said, hey, yeah, college students, you're fine. We're not going to focus our attention on you. We're going to focus it on the communities that actually need this. And their numbers were extremely low. I mean, they're high in the sense that they're the highest density in the country for a retirement community. So their numbers on the surface look bad, but their ratio percentages were the lowest in the country, one of the lowest. So it just goes to show how much leadership can change in that manner. Um,
Let me
and
ask you. Let me ask you a question since you're comparing DeSantis and Walz.
and I was actually just going to say, could we pause right here because I just have to run to the bathroom quick.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I'll,
absolutely.
I'll be right back.
One eternity later.
Good.
it's okay.
No, you're okay, dude.
So let me ask you this question,
Yeah.
Dustin. Since we're comparing Walz and DeSantis, when COVID started, DeSantis followed the trend. He did the lockdown thing, and then he got the information. He started to realize, hey, wait, this is wrong, and then he's like, nope, Florida's open. So at any point during COVID, did Walz decide he was going to change his ways, or was he constant, lockdown, blame game, the whole thing?
Yeah, and the unfortunate reality here in Minnesota, he did change his mind quite a bit in the opposite direction. There's actually quite a bit of Freedom of Information Act emails that were recovered, and I wish I could quote this one verbatim, but this is the essence of this one. He actually had two of his members of his administration that were going over numbers on, I believe it was funerals. I might be incorrect on the type of gathering, but it was a type of gathering. And in the email, they go, we didn't even recommend to go that low for numbers of gathering. This was the governor's decision. And in essence, his administration, the quote unquote, the scientists, the experts, were recommending a number. And then by his own bidding, made them even more strict. And that just goes to show how just kind of willy-nilly he was with this entire process. It just was
So,
kind of a whim. He had this system
so
called the
one
Dial.
video,
Mhm.
one video that you shared, Dustin, was it haunts me. Like it sits in my mind because it totally sums up the authoritarian mindset that seems to plague his entire administration. But this video was of a family on their own porch during COVID, trying to get some fresh air, and he had the guard and police going down the middle of the street shooting at families with paintball guns, gas pepper balls, what they're using there, doing real damage to people for sitting on their porch. Was that something that he owned, or was that a breakdown somewhere in his
Yeah,
administration?
and that's a good
happened there?
question. And I don't exactly remember which report this was from, but they had multiple reports after the riots were all completed and done, and it was frequently reported back that there was very little guidance on this entire process. There wasn't a specific way they were going to do things. It was just kind of thrown together and out there. So you did have a lot of these situations where you didn't have a consistent mission throughout this entire process. So, I mean, it's not like they ordered, go pepper spray people and, shoot them with paintball guns on their front porch. That's probably just a situation where that one group was doing that and maybe felt a little too powerful. But at the end of the day, the managers of that entire process have to kind of give their orders, especially a guy who's quote unquote been a command sergeant major. I mean, he reached that level for 45 days, I think, as we mentioned. Didn't retire that way, but he likes to say that he continued that. It's not the case, but you would think that individual knows the chain of command on this and gives those orders on, hey, here's how we're actually going to do this process and how everything's going to go. And ultimately, a lot of these reports came back and saying that, like, hey, the governor kind of failed really in this regard. There wasn't a clear mission on how we would do it. And, just quite frankly, a just complete abject failure in how we
Were there any
responded.
repercussions?
What was that?
Were there any repercussions? Like, did anyone involved in that have any
No.
blowback?
The only one I can really even think of for repercussions on, um, quote unquote police brutality on some of this stuff. I mean, there was some blowback in the media when that paintball situation occurred. There was a lot of pushback, and they did listen, but I don't believe there was any legal anything ramifications in
Did
that manner.
did anybody
It
try to
kills me because
fight back? Because I'm saying this
Yeah.
in the South, so
Oh
specifically
no.
in
Oh
the
yeah.
area that if that would have happened down here,
Somebody
look,
might have shot back.
I'm all for cops. I have nothing against them, but
Mhm.
if you're gonna follow an order like that, I'm gonna shoot you.
This did happen one time. It was a completely separate scenario, but and kind of like 3 degrees of separation in that 7 degrees scenario. I had maybe 1 or 2 degrees here of separation in this instance, but I had some law enforcement friends who were good friends with this individual, and they kind of pretty much disowned them after this all happened. Um, but there was a situation where a black male was in a parking lot with some other friends, and a cop vehicle. I think it was I believe it was like an armored one, but they started shooting. They were non-lethal rounds. These were just like pellet guns, basically. But start shooting at this group of individuals. You're being shot at for no reason. You're just in a parking lot. And this is one of those scenarios of like, this paintball situation should have happened, and this situation shouldn't have happened with law enforcement. They're like, you know, so many situations where law enforcement is just given the bad end of something. Kim Potter is one in particular I think of where she ended up getting jailed for accidentally shooting someone thinking that she had a and I'm non-lethal. And I'm just spacing here.
Is she the one that grabbed her pistol instead of her taser?
Yeah, taser.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
why that was spacing me. There's literally one behind me
She
right
got a
here.
lot of blowback because she had been
Yeah,
on the job for a
for
pretty
so
long
many
time,
years.
so
Yeah,
she should know the difference.
yeah, and but the main thing was that Keith Ellison, the attorney general at the time, went, charges over what should have been done. And, you know, sometimes just situations where they maybe go too far when you look at the full context of it. But this just wasn't one of those scenarios. The cop was clearly in the wrong. And yeah, the individual did shoot back with a real gun, thinking that they were being shot at. So that did happen in one scenario, and there was repercussions for that cop. He did end up seeing some charges. I forget what they
Good.
exactly were, but that is the only scenario in which I actually saw that in regard to actually fighting back. But to make just things really bad here in the state of Minnesota is that there was some new gun laws passed basically where you kind of can't do that anymore. Shoot back. Um,
What? What's the point?
yeah, there's a new retreat law, and I have not read through this thing entirely. I saw a post by one of our gun owners organizations here who does really good work, Gun Owners Caucus. So if you look into that one, that might be a good one to add into the notes here. But there was a new law recently passed, or it was a order came down from a judge where it's pretty difficult in this state to actually defend yourself, and which is just goes to show the irony of all of this. With Tim Walz in particular, going back to the start of his career, a lot of people don't realize he was an A-rated NRA endorsed member of Congress, and yeah, he knows how to do statute
Oh,
reference it
lost
in
your audio.
Congress, but
There we go.
very quickly, the moment the political tides were changing on him, so he's winning re-election over and over, coming up to his gubernatorial run. Eventually, he's within single digits, and he knows it's kind of over for that district. Like, he's going to lose the next time he runs. So he completely changes his entire persona. He immediately goes against the Second Amendment. Now he's one of the worst members on the issue. He now goes even crazier on his abortion stances. He votes yes on legislation to give medical services to a child who survives an abortion, but then reverts his vote back to allow that child to die with no medical care whatsoever. And so, to the point where
Evil.
Nancy Pelosi is saying, you have to tone it down. So, what does he do when he goes and runs
Wow.
for governor as the moderate in this state? Because Democrats didn't like him. He lost his endorsement, actually. A lot of people would be maybe surprised knowing his record today, but he lost his endorsement for governor, for the Democrat endorsement. DFL is what we call them here. And because he quite frankly wasn't crazy enough for them, he was perceived as an extreme moderate. But he was able to go up on stage and go, well, Nancy Pelosi said that I need to turn it down. That's how to turn things down. That's how pro-choice I am. And hey, we can't have these weapons of war. And now I'm F-rated with the NRA. These were his talking points when he ran for governor, because he needed to be a moderate, quote unquote, to have his congressional seat in southern Minnesota, where now we're winning that seat by double digits. It's the opposite case in this scenario now. But when you're running for governor, you got to do that. So he actually had to take on a lieutenant governor who was even crazier than the other ones running. So that's how we get Peggy Flanagan in this situation. So they had to go crazier, and they still wasn't enough. They weren't deemed crazy enough to get their endorsement, but they went to a primary knowing that they would have some moderate support in greater Minnesota, plus some institutional crazy support in this metro with Peggy Flanagan. And it was enough to overcome the endorsed candidates of, I believe it was Mary Murphy, and Erin May Quaid was the endorsed ticket. And then the rest is history. They've just gone left and left and left every single year. To the point where we're at this point in everything nationally now, where we know his record because we see it. But the real question is, like, has he always been, this leftist? And I do think so. He's always been this crazy. It's just that he's kind of a political chameleon, where he wants to climb this political ladder of power over and over and over. And that's how this whole story, I think, comes into play of, like, exaggerating your record, exaggerating your accomplishments, where you just have to do that to climb this ladder. But also you reach points where, well, I can't have that stance anymore. I have to have this stance. And you just change like a political chameleon. Because even when you go back to his years just as a teacher, like, there's no politics here. Even before that, like, he goes to school with the Harvard program to go teach in China. He's gone back 30 times since.
So
And he's
speaking
teaching in
of
class.
China,
Yes.
we actually had a question
Oh.
relating to that, and one of our followers, asked, there's a lot with Walz in China. Is there anything, substantial there with his connections, or is he just another xenophile?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, honestly, just a lot still has to be dug up on that. Again, there's actually a really good article where one of his classmates actually comes out and basically says he's a straight up Maoist. So that's a really good story to look into for you guys, and for the audience out there. Recommend following up on that one. But as well, you look at his wedding anniversary is the 5-year anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Intentionally. Glenn Walz told a local paper that they intentionally chose that date so they could remember. Well, because Tim, she says in the article, Tim wanted a date he would remember for the rest of his life. So you chose the massacre.
That's just weird.
That's awful.
It's weird.
So,
Which also, and this was funny because I didn't know this until that Elf art. The one area I just know very little about, frankly, is the China stuff, but I've been learning quite a bit about it throughout this process. And I just have to say that really explains the burning tire video, where she went on a local outlet here and said that she opened the windows during the riots so she could smell the burning tires and just kind of remember and take in this moment in history. It's like, that's kind of eerie and weird, and kind of
Yes,
like your
I've got
5-year
that
anniversary
candle
of
burning right now
of
in my
protesters.
room.
So in all, if a Walz Harris Walz administration happens, free abortion for everybody, any given time. It doesn't matter how long you've been pregnant. No guns. They're going to take all your guns. They're going to buy back your guns. They're going to lock everybody away. Martial law probably for any little tiny thing. Um,
Free speech. A
yeah,
lot of people are familiar with the video where he says there's no guarantee to free speech, especially when it
no.
comes to hate speech and our democracy. Um, and this is somewhat known out there, but it hasn't got as much attention because it's difficult to directly coordinate it to right to Walz, but ultimately his administration budgeted for it. He budgeted money for this program. So he endorses it. There's no doubt about it. But a bias registry is what they call it. It's a hate speech registry, but they call it a bias registry. And in which case, a good friend of mine and legislator here uh, in the state of Minnesota, there's a couple of them that have really good arguments on this. But this one in particular is Harry Niska. And he goes on the House floor and also in committee, but challenges the authors of this one and goes, well, let's see what bias is. I'm going to ask you some questions on what that could be. And one of them is, well, I'm going to post on social media that I think COVID-19 was created in a lab in Wuhan, China. What do you think about that? And then the individual is of Asian descent of some type. I won't, I'm not going to guess on exactly what, but she basically states back that, yep, that could be definitely referenced as bias or hateful speech because it's targeting a specific community of individuals. So imagine going back, especially to this time during COVID, if they have this bias registry during COVID, knowing that how this administration looks at um, these conspiracy theories, and they actually push the truth. They push the truth. It was made in a lab in Wuhan, China. It ended up being true. They would have put you on a list. And how would the government use that list? When the government's making lists, it is never, ever good. There's never a scenario where this ends up being good or pretty. You would have been put on that registry at that point, and how would that data have been used? That's a good question, and it certainly would have been abused, like the Patriot Act or any of these other um, uh, pieces where there's just over surveillance and whatnot. But also, Perry went further on into it and said, "What if I wore a shirt that just says I love J.K. Rowling? Um, is that deemed hateful?" And she basically goes on to say, well, kind of depends on the intent, I'm sure, but I'll let the lawyers decide that.
I think I recall seeing that one.
And that
Yeah.
just whenever you're just deferring to the lawyers after you clearly lost that first argument there, because he states at the end of that one, well, that ended up being true, so find it very concerning that we're going to put people on lists for speaking the truth, not conspiracy theory, ended up being true. We're going to put them on a list. She got just drilled there. So then this question comes up, and she's like, I almost wonder, like, was her answer yes, but then just defers.
Yeah, no, her
The
answer was
lawyers.
yes, definitely yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, that's another situation here where we're just seeing insane stuff. And, coming back to our 30 trips in China, I'm sorry, I'm just going to mute text here because my laptop is
China.
connected over to those.
Also, Mark will probably be out for the rest of the episode. He just said his entire internet just went out. So
Oh, that happens. No,
it
but
happens, but we can continue
yeah,
on
I mean,
without
just going
him.
back to the whole China concept, like, how much did he learn in China? Um, he he's also quoted in some local articles on basically communism. China is basically just everyone is treated equally and given equally, and basically just distribution of wealth. Everyone's on the same level, and just like this is just such a elementary understanding of socialism and communism. And if those are your beliefs and your past classmates are calling you a straight up Maoist, You've got your wedding anniversary is the 5th year anniversary of a massacre of protesters, so you can remember it. You've been to China 30 times. How much of this stuff did you learn in China, Tim? You just got to
Yeah.
ask that to yourself. And I kind of forget where I was going with that at the end, but oh yeah, coming back to his time in teaching, like, how long has he had these beliefs? If you go back to his time in teaching, he actually has students interviewing on NPR, which is the version of Minnesota Public Radio, NPR. They give just a 20-second split there, but they say why he was one of their favorite teachers, and good positive things like very involved teacher. And I had some crazy liberals that I still enjoyed as teachers because they were very involved. But this statement just caught me off guard a little bit. It wasn't a regular geography class, he goes on to say. He was a very cultured man, being a cultured guy who's a world traveler and all. We would do, not normal things it's not about maps and graphs and geography, but we would read excerpts from the Quran. So now we're teaching the Quran in geography classes, but going back to, I think, maybe 2023, he's on the record for being very much against teaching the 10 Commandments in school. But when you were teaching excerpts of the Quran. But today you're against teaching the 10 Commandments, which I have no problem if a teacher or a legislator is like, hey, we just don't teach religion,
Yeah, but I mean,
I
it's
got no
par for
problem
the
with that.
course.
But when you're okay doing it in practice with this one, and you're excluding this other one later in life, where are your belief systems? Has anything ever been consistent in your entire life? I
Well,
would
his
like to
belief
believe so.
system
No.
also led him to, give tampons to boys. So, I mean, who knows? I mean, his science is just messed up. I don't
And
know
then
where he gets
they
his
call him
information.
Tampon Tim.
Yep.
One of the greatest videos on the internet today, right now, is Trump calling him Tampon Tim, and I'm just
I've made a few memes about it, but I wanted to get to this last question. You answered kind of the second one already, but the third one is, why did Harris pick Walz? Because, you know, to everyone it seems, it just doesn't seem like they vetted the guy. He's lied about so much, and I don't know if it's because they want to kind of take some of that away from Kamala's lack of everything, that they just kind of want to focus on, Tim Walz and run the, oh, JD Vance is weird, instead of, having to worry about Shapiro, who I thought they were going to pick because he's more moderate. He would have pulled a lot more votes from RFK when, they dropped out. And so it just doesn't make any sense why they would pick him.
yeah, and I think the answer might kind of disappoint some people, where I think they were just looking at it very logically in this sense, is that they were looking at the states they had to win, and it was just very Midwest. And your options for that were the female governor, Michigan there, Walz, as well as I think they were looking at more of the Kentucky guy. And
Maybe
just,
Bashir, yeah.
Bashir. And ultimately, a lot of it just came down to, Tim actually is a pretty good communicator. He's a good speaker. He's well spoken. When he isn't challenged, of course. When he gets challenged, he kind of has an anger issue. He can yell, and it can come off very poorly, and it has in the past. But when you can give him this perfect environment, he's pretty well spoken, and he can do pretty good things there. He's a good communicator. And you're looking at the region where he's, successful in, the Midwest, in particular, Union country. You look at a guy like JD Vance and his union record, which is pretty strong. You got to kind of counter that a little bit, make sure you can shore up your support in the Midwest, and then go out, win everything else. And how good were your chances in Arizona with Mark Kelly? It still was going to be tough. And then Shapiro, there still was going to be some issues being moderate, actually bringing out your base, especially when you look at some of these states you're struggling in. There's significant Muslim population centers.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be very frank, a very anti-Semitic base. Tim Walz is actually somewhat pretty pro-Israel. I mean, he's made pretty pro-Israel comments in the past.
For now.
He's definitely a supporter, but he also has like this really good base of support with the anti-Semites as well in Minnesota, because we have a significant Muslim population here, one of the bigger ones. I want to say like 60% of all Somalians in the country are.
I call Minnesota New Somalia.
Yeah, I was about to say.
There was that video where he is literally sitting down and, Tim Walz says, hold on a second. And he goes and he changes the state flag. And I'm sitting there and it looks like the flag of Somalia. And I'm just sitting here and I'm like, how does this happen in America?
Yeah, and also just to go about even that state flag change, because everyone hates it here. KSTP did a poll on this local outlet, and they found like basically 70% of the state do not like the new flag. Like, it's a significant amount of people. So the Star Tribune, a local outlet here, the largest newspaper, actually put out a piece saying like, oh, Tim Walz he didn't change the state flag, it was the committee. Well, but who made the committee? It was the governor. It was the legislative process. It was your it was your trifecta government, your Senate, your House, and your governor. You were the ones that pushed the committee. You selected the people, and this is what they came out to be. And it's even funnier when you actually look at the flag that made it and was picked as the final one. It's got 3 stripes that are kind of that green, blue, white. It's got a star, but it's not the same star at all, and I think it's even offset. It's not the same flag at all. And then they're like, we're going to change 70% of this flag and make it into this, and then that's our new state flag. But the flag gets a lot of attention, but honestly, the thing that irks me more than anything about this whole process is they also changed our seal, which the design of the seal looks great. It's a loon, a red-eye loon. It looks actually pretty beautiful. I'm a big fan of that part. But what they did after that was striking to me. The committee ended up striking the language, which is more of the French language of, North Star State. And they changed it to a local native language, which, again, I don't really have that too much of a problem with that. This is a lot of this area is native land, and make it more that way. I got no problem there. But what they did after that was what really struck me is they took out the year the state was founded, because they had the date 1850 something, our year our state was founded, because it might offend Native Americans, because how was the state founded? We took it by force. That's how that. They removed the year the state was founded from our state seal. So it's just like how much of this stuff they're just willing to bend to the far left on anything.
So can you educate me a little bit on Minnesota history? So if I recall correctly, from 2 decades ago when I was learning about our country, Minnesota, was that part of the Louisiana Purchase?
That's a good question. I believe so.
So if that's the case, land would have already been conquered before the state was created, and then the state was bought by another country, and then so how would that be offensive to Native Americans? We didn't like run in there and bang, 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 and this is Minnesota. We bought it from the French.
Yeah, and that's a good question that honestly not a question to ask me because
Well,
I did not do very well in geography.
So
In history.
Minnesota was part of the
It
Louisiana
was okay.
Purchase in 1803. Thank you, Grok. But yeah.
Thank you, Grok.
Anyways, just because we're crunching on time,
Mhm.
there has been some breaking news, which is actually surprising to me.
Mhm.
Trump put out a statement that he supports Amendment 3,
Mhm.
which is marijuana legalization in Florida. And Trump is very anti drug, but he says, as everyone knows, I was and will be again the most respected law and order president in U.S. history. We will take our streets back by being tough and smart on violent and all other types of crime in Florida. Like many other states that have already given their approval, personal amounts of marijuana will be legalized for adults with Amendment 3. Whether people like it or not, this will happen through the approval of the voters, so it should be done correctly. We need the state legislature to responsibly create laws that prohibit the use of it in public spaces so we do not smell marijuana everywhere we go, like we do in many other Democrat run cities. At the same time, someone should not be a criminal in Florida when this is legal in so many other states. We do not need to ruin lives and waste taxpayer dollars arresting adults with personal amounts of it on them, and no one should be grieve a loved one because they died from a fentanyl laced marijuana. We will make America safe again. And to be honest, I kind of agree with that statement. I don't like marijuana, but I don't think taxpayer dollars should be wasted putting, nonviolent offenders that are just smoking weed in their home.
Mhm.
so Dustin, on a previous episode, we discussed some of this, and Zach and I actually discussed it quite a bit on Twitter, and specifically on Twitter, I asked my community, what is the most liberal stance that you have on anything, just any given subject, and I gave mine, and mine was I don't smoke. I don't even smoke cigarettes anymore. I smoke the occasional cigar. The last time I smoked was with Zach, maybe 2, 3 a year, or 2 or 3 nights. Let's say nights because I smoked two that night, I think. But I don't. I don't. I'm not a smoker, but I don't think that marijuana should be illegal in any
Mhm.
shape, form, or fashion. I think if you want to smoke it, smoke it. However, I do like this. I'm with Zach on this one. I like the just don't smoke that crap in public. Smoke it on your back porch or something. So
Yeah.
your thoughts?
Yeah, no, and actually, and this is, one of the, at the time, a lot of people were pushing back. This is draconian, which I did not agree with at all. Um, is Minnesota, banned smoking indoors with cigarettes.
Yeah.
So you had to go smoke it by the dumpster or have a designated smoking area outside. I actually love that law. Um, you
It's in
know,
Alabama as well.
Yep.
yeah, and I think that's more. That's in a lot of places now, and I think that should be pretty similar to the marijuana thing. Frankly, is just like you just have to, you know, pick these spots where it's okay and it's not. You smoke it in your house, whatever. Yeah, I'm pretty libertarian. In all honesty, the first candidate that got me involved in politics is Ron Paul.
Okay.
All of
I
us.
I, I, I became a delegate for him in 2012. Made it pretty far up the process. I think I got just short of state as a 20-year-old in that
Wow.
process. So, and that was a fun one. And one of my quote unquote more liberal stances is I'm pretty anti-drug war. I'm not huge into
Yeah.
going against that, but also at the same time, like I was the youth group kid. Um, I have never smoked a cigarette in my life. There's a lot of alcohol behind me, but this is my father-in-law's basement right now because we're about to do a family function. Um, I really don't drink. I can count on one hand how many beers I've had this year. Never smoked, nothing. that's just not me. We've got some family history of abuse, and
Mm.
very early age,
Yep.
God kind of came into my life and was like, do not touch that stuff.
Yep. Yep.
And that's kind of been my stance, but also just like, I like liberty and I don't like telling people what to do as long as it does not hurt another human.
Yep.
But in this case, like an example, just keep that out of public places. That's the ideal situation in my view.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at some of these waitresses back in the day who would die of cancer and they never
Mhm.
smoked a cigarette in their life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just one of those situations, just keep it out of, reach of children, have it well regulated. And quite frankly, if it's well regulated, it's going to be safer. You're less likely to have it laced, different things like that. So that's a good thing. But coming back to that marijuana thing, actually on, making it legal is good. But, having some pretty strict restrictions around it,
Yeah.
we legalized marijuana here in the state of Minnesota. We added a bunch of stuff in there, like we're going to fund solar panels and stuff with the legislation. It
Give money to
really
China.
just liberal green shit, which is why some of our Republican marijuana folks were voting against it, because they just threw a bunch of crap in there, and they're like, well, if you voted against it, you're anti-freedom. Well, we're voting against it because of all these other things you just kind of pork barreled into it. But they put together these things, and then they had to pick commissioners for this process. They had to actually pick the boss to, actually carry out these laws and practices. And Governor Walz appointed somebody for this position, and they ran their own marijuana type business. And it turns out that they themselves were not following the actual laws that were set in this legislature for the marijuana laws. So within a day, she quit.
Wow.
So then we were absent without a commissioner for this new, basically, division of government of legalized marijuana. And then even partway through that, the legal marijuana commissioner quit. So then we had no commissioners under these processes. So just coming back and circling this back to Governor Tim Walz is just like, how much failure can you have in this process where, even a guy like me, where like I kind of agree on legalization. I'm fairly libertarian in that sense. I mean, I'm never going to touch the stuff, but fairly libertarian. I kind of agree with you.
Yeah.
But just complete swing and miss on actually implementing this stuff, and failures. And that goes down to even all the stuff on, all the fraud that happened in the state. We were the victims of the largest federal fraud on COVID. We lost well over 250 million. That 250 million is that low number, but we lost that to money that was supposed to go to feeding starving kids. Feeding our future was the fraud scheme, but we lost all of that under his education commission area. So the education portion of our government was able to distribute those funds to nonprofits. They messed up along the way, and there's a lot of reports on this. So it falls a lot on Governor Walz, and a lot of the initial blame went on Keith Ellison, but turns out most of it should have went on Walz throughout the process. But they both shared blame, but more of it on Walz at this point. They lost a lot of money, more than anyone else in the country on that matter. And to make matters even worse, Governor Walz's administration gave an award for entrepreneurship to one of the defendants in the case that was guilty. And to this day, the award is still up on DHS's website, that this individual has received an award for entrepreneurship.
Wow. Well, hey, Dustin, I want to thank you for coming by on the show. We got about a minute or so left. If you want to plug yourself, where can we find you? I think I read something about you're a columnist.
Yeah, no, that came pretty quick after a lot of stuff broke. People were just like, hey, we like your content. We'd like you to write for us. And, I actually got multiple offers on this stuff, which is kind of cool. So I actually turned down a couple people. But yeah, I ended up going with Town Hall in this situation. So I've got one column currently out there, which calls for Republicans to unite around Trump and Vance, because and just goes into the history of. I can't believe we didn't even cover this, but go to town hall, read my column on it, on how Tim Walz and Kamala Harris actually started their collaboration for vice president in an abortion clinic in Minnesota. That they met at an abortion clinic in March of 2024, just months before they ran. That's where this all started. And if you go through that process and learning about Minnesota's law and how Kamala Harris is the first vice president in U.S. history to visit an abortion clinic, and did it with her running mate, by the way. Make no mistake, if these two get in, they will legalize abortion up to the moment of birth. They will legalize letting a baby who survives an abortion to die on a table. They will remove parental notification. They will go all in on everything. And you Republicans must unite to defeat the extreme abortionists, which are Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, most extreme ticket in U.S. history.
And I will close on something Mark would say. This is why the Senate race is also very important. We have to use federalism to stop Kamala and Tim Walz if they end up being successful. But we will do everything in our power to make sure they are held accountable. And I will leave it at that. Dustin, thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you on X.
See you guys.
See ya.